Welcome back to another edition of Rewind Roundtable. It's the Leafs Red Wings 1993 Norris Division Semi-Finals, and after some overtime heroics by Mike Foligno in Game 5, the Leafs are up 3-2 in this series and returning home to Maple Leaf Gardens with all of the momentum. And to break it all down, we got the gang back together: Paul Hendrick, Joe Bowen, and Big Daddy Bob McGill. So let's make our rounds. How is everyone doing? Joe, how are you today?
Oh, good. Had to virtually celebrate my son Sean's 30th birthday the other day, so he's doing good, and I can only imagine what the first day inside a pub's going to be like for the Bowen family. We've got 4 birthdays that are going to have to be celebrated, so we may need ambulance care immediately.
I hear you, Joe. Mine was earlier this week with myself, and didn't get a chance to celebrate with the whole gang either. But you know what? Through these times, we got to do what we got to do, and when everything is said and done, I'm sure we'll have a big celebration to make sure everybody's birthday was accounted for.
Well, happy belated. Henny, you've been eating some Captain Crunch cereal?
Yeah, my daughter's boyfriend from Denver, Aiden, sent me up a box. It's our co-favorite. And he did a caricature of the captain, but sort of made it around me, which was really nice. And we paid for a plane ticket of his at one point. So he was just getting back and saying thank you.
Okay, so let's dive back into this game. Of course, Leafs are returning home for Game 6 at Maple Leaf Gardens. But in our previous episode of the Rewind Roundtable, we had Mike Foligno as a guest, and he was talking about the sheer elation that he experienced. Of course, we know that notorious celebration, the Foligno leap. Bob, take us back to that moment. What do you recall about it?
Well, you know, I mean, so emotional, no question about it. And, you know, after being down 0-2 in the series, when things kicked off in the first 2 games at Joe Louis Arena, you go back to Maple Leaf Gardens and you scratch out a couple of victories to tie the series up. And the pesky veteran in Mike Foligno scores that big goal to give the Leafs a 3-2 advantage in the series and 3 consecutive wins in the series as well. I mean, just the jubilation in the dressing room and at Joe Louis after the game, and then coming home for Game 6, feeling like you were on top of the world. It was a great feeling, no question, and everybody in Leafs Nation was, you know, up and down with the emotions of the series as well. And it was electric heading into the building on Carlton Street that evening, no question.
In this particular game, good start for the Maple Leafs. They're up 2-1 after one period. The excitement certainly in the building. This Detroit team can strike and strike quickly. Dino Ciccarelli, 26 seconds into the middle frame, and then all of a sudden you give up a power play goal and a couple of shorties, and the heart's ripped right out of you. Felix is pulled, and it's let's just get ready for Game 7. But we don't get to experience the fun and the elation of Game 7 without enduring the pain of what we will see here tonight. And that's just the way sport is sometimes.
No question about it. And I think the big thing is you know, special teams and, you know, not just in the regular season, but in the playoffs become so very important. And the Red Wings flex their muscle, no question, in game number 6 in Toronto. And that second period, as you said, Ciccarelli ends up with a hat trick. All 3 goals scored via the power play. You get a couple of shorthanded tallies by the Red Wings as well, including Stevie Yzerman, his 4th of the series. And boy, oh boy, it was just the feeling around Maple Leaf Gardens at the end of the second period of play. You could have heard a pin drop in the place, whereas heading into the matchup, the electricity in the air was so unbelievable. And then where it stood heading into period number 3, where everyone was just looking around at each other. It's like, is this really happening? I mean, it was unbelievable.
I'm curious to know the psychological factor in all of this in Game 6, because Bob, you had referenced the crowd, that there was a tension in the air. Was that something that reflected on the ice as well, where you guys just were your own worst enemy at certain times?
Well, you know, it seems funny because, you know, the Red Wings score the first goal of the hockey game. And then late in the first period, back-to-back goals by the Leafs, including Andrechuk's sixth, and the place was electric. And then in the second period, things get going right off the hop. And I think, Paul, you alluded to the fact that Ciccarelli, less than a minute into that second period, scores to tie the game. And then it just, all heck broke loose from there. You've got such a great veteran leadership group and guys that have been through the wars and had won Stanley Cups in different stops in their careers. I mean, Glenn Anderson certainly had one of those guys, Mike Krushelnyski, Dougie Gilmore, Jamie McCowan, all had won Stanley Cups before. And all of them were saying, hey, it's not over till it's over.
One of the things, too, we should mention, and then how good the Red Wings were. And special teams in this series were an enormous factor. The two shorthanded goals, the Leafs had 3 power play opportunities in this game, scored once and gave up 2. The Red Wings scored 4 times with the man advantage, and it was 4 of 6. And when you went through the entire series, the Leafs were 4 for 28 after this game, and the Red Wings were 11 of 30. And so the special teams were a huge, huge factor in this. And when you've got Fedorov and Yzerman and Coffey and all of these great offensive players, and Nick Lidstrom was an afterthought. He was just getting into his Hall of Fame career. They had an enormous, never mind Probert and Ciccarelli, who were causing havoc in front of Felix Potvin, but they had an enormous talent base. And they were able to really, when things got rolling good for them, it was tough to put the brakes on. And this game, I recall an article written that criticized Steve Yzerman. It's sort of like poking the bear,
yes.
And they were saying he wasn't playing well. It wasn't up to snuff. He wasn't but he was just an offensive juggernaut from the day one coming into the National Hockey League. And this series was no different. When he got going, the Red Wings really got going.
As well, Danielle, we look back to how this team was built. And there's the big trade by Cliff, obviously, January 2nd of 92 to bring in Dougie from Calgary. But the trade, Bob and Joe, I look back on was Al Iafrate going to the Washington Capitals. And this trade made by then General Manager Floyd Smith to bring Pete Cecil and Bob Rouse into the fold. And as good as Iafrate was, it turned out to be a pretty good deal and maybe one of Floyd's best as a Maple Leaf general manager. Maybe a comment from both you guys on your reflections of those two players and what that deal might have meant to Toronto.
Well, obviously Peter Zazzle was such a key cog in the wheel, but for me, the guy that doesn't get talked about enough, and he was instrumental in helping the Maple Leafs get to the conference finals in 93 and again in 94. He went on to Detroit after his tenure here in Toronto and won a pair of Stanley Cups with the Red Wings as well. And the thing about Bobby Rouse, he was as tough as they come, and he didn't fight very much. But when he did, and I can say I was there to witness it, and I'll tell you, he was such an anchor back there. And when you needed somebody to protect, be that last line of defense, he was a guy that stood front and center every time and didn't get a lot of accolades. But here's a guy that went on and played 1,061 games in his regular season career and 136 playoff games, including a pair of Stanley Cups. So Bobby Rouse was that good. And I'll tell you, what a trade that was for the Maple Leafs.
I think one of the things, too, that we've talked about earlier is about that there was not a Norris Trophy candidate amongst the Leaf defense. But as Pat Burns often said, it was the best group that it was in the National Hockey League. And so when you think about, well, we have to have a shutdown pair, they probably had 4 guys that you would suggest were legitimate shutdown pairs. And if you had Dave Ellett in there as the offensive guru and maybe Dmitry Mironov as an offensive defenseman, you were able to really kind of do a lot of great things. But through the course of the season and through the course of the games that they won, this group was as good as any in the National Hockey League. And it's the reason the Leafs end up winning this series, and it's the reason they ended up going into a 7th game with Los Angeles 2 series later. So Bob Rouse, you're right. And I often thought, too, that Sylvain Lefebvre may have been the best one-on-one defensive defenseman in the National Hockey League. And unfortunately, the top prize in the National Hockey League goes to the players usually that produce more offensive stats. And God, I wish they would change that. Certainly we could have a Bobby Orr trophy for that. And certainly we could have the Defensive Defenseman Award being awarded for a defenseman.
Let's not forget the guy that played over 600 games on the blue line for the Maple Leafs, and that's Todd Gill. And this 92-93 season was his breakout campaign. And let's go back, I believe it was the Montreal Forum, Joe, in that coast-to-coast Todd Gill rush up the ice, and he ends up scoring the big goal to beat the Canadians. And I think that just sort of took the shackles off him. He had a career year at 43 points, and I think really sort of took his game to that next level. And, Todd Gill was one of those guys where he wasn't the biggest guy, but I'll tell you, he would fight anybody. He was tough as nails. And he was such a stalwart, not only in that year, but his entire career here as a Maple Leaf.
I mean, his heart was on his sleeve. He would do anything that was possible to help a teammate or to aid in a victory. And if it meant playing less, if it meant playing more, if it meant being more offensive, more defensive, whatever it was, Todd was going to do it or die trying. And I think that was one of the things that I always appreciated about not only him, but a lot of the guys on this team from the 92, 93, 94 campaigns. They all were very selfless. They all were team-oriented. They were all result-oriented.
And another player that stood out for me was Glenn Anderson, who, at least offensively, didn't play a major role in this series. But his physicality, the threat of what he was able to do offensively, he was a 3-time 100 penalty minute guy in his career, 6 Stanley Cups, went on to win a cup a little over a year later with the Rangers. The Stanley Cup just seemed to follow him, and he followed it. It was a heck of a deal to get him into Toronto as well, and just what he did to make the other players, namely Andrechuk and Gilmore, better. But Mike Foligno said it in our show last week. Glenn Anderson, for an offensively skilled player like that, was a nasty piece of business.
He was a guy that, he always, was that big player. He showed up for those big moments. And that's, the most important part, and the reason why he's in the Hall of Fame today is that, he would do things. He was unafraid to crash the net and run over the opposition goaltender and get under the skin of opposition's top players as well. But then when you needed that big goal, he'd be front and center and score that big goal to help propel you to that next level. And that was, I thought, something about Glenn Anderson that was second to none.
I mentioned that we were celebrating my son Sean's 30th birthday. Well, back in '92, Sean was diagnosed with leukemia and was in the hospital. Little 2-year-old little guy. And Glenn Anderson, Felix Potvin, Doug Gilmore, Mike Foligno, and a bunch of them came up to visit Sean. Sean wouldn't be able to recognize him or anything. But I've always said about these visits, and Bobby, I know you've been a part of a lot of them, when the players of any team, of any sport, go to sick kids' hospital to visit little tykes, it's not so much the little guys who are in the hospital that appreciate or need the visit. It's the parents. The parents need the shot in the arm. They're struggling to go through this, watching their little one under some severe situations. And when you guys arrive, and these guys did, they came in and visited us for a little while, and I thank them very, very much. And for the next 2 hours, they were visiting everybody on the floor in the oncology area. And I often say that to them, it's appreciated for those little guys who are in there and the little fans, and some of them don't even know who you are. But I can rest assured that every parent knows who you are. Every parent appreciates the visit and the support in a very difficult time. Again, this was what this team was like. For a little guy who was only 2 years of age, who celebrated his 30th birthday this week.
And just going to add, little Sean Bowen at age 30, so proud of that guy. He's a colleague of ours, great producer, does football with the Argos as well, so well-rounded. He's physically filled out, Joe, and we thank our medical staff here. They've done a great job with little Sean. Bobby, Felix gets pulled, and why not? I mean, you might as well save him. It's going to Game 7. The Red Wings have just scored 5 goals, 5 consecutively. How would a young man like that at the age of 21 handle that, knowing that this was not one of his better performances, and yet for the 3rd time in the series, this great Red Wing team has managed to find a way to light him up? Well,
you know what? That was, I think, the big thing with Felix was that it was like water off a duck's back. He didn't let it get to him. Yeah, he obviously didn't like the fact that he gave up as many goals as he did, no question. But he knew that he was going to have the opportunity to have a day in between to reflect back on what he could have done differently and then get right back at it and get ready for Game 7. And I'll tell you, he was so good throughout the course of that whole run, all the way to Game 7 against the Kings in round number 3. But difficult, no question, as you say, a young guy. And I think it just showed everybody that this kid was not just a flash in the pan. He was going to be one of those players that was going to have a tremendous career. And because of the fact that he could shake off what happened to them in a big moment in Game 6, as he did against the Red Wings. It's that even keel guy, and I think that was the big thing when he shrugged it off after what happened to him in Game 6 to be able to do what he did in Game 7 to help the Maple Leafs get on to the next round.
Bobby, was Felix, most goalies are either very introvert, very quiet, or very extrovert. I work with one, Ralphie, who I will put down as the extrovert.
Yes.
I always thought that Felix was very quiet and within himself and to himself. Was he the type of guy that you, like Eddie Balfour, you didn't talk to game day? I mean, you just didn't go near him. What was Felix like game day? And that personality that you say about even keel, was he approachable, or did you just stay away from him and let him do his business?
Well, what's funny, Joe, is that I've always, been very close with every goaltender I played with, because, I was the guy to always try and, when I messed up in front of them and they bailed me out, it was like, hey, I always made sure that they knew that, hey, you saved my bacon. But Cat was a quiet guy, but I think a lot, at his young age, he had a little bit of difficulty with the English language, a little bit. And I think that sort of made him a little bit more introverted. But when you talk to him one-on-one, I always thought he was very engaging, and, he would have difficulty trying to announce some different things. But as a whole, it's amazing when you see him years, in between, at those outdoor games that we've both been in. It's amazing to see him, and it's just like you haven't missed a beat in the time you played with the guy. And I think that's something where, to me, he was a guy that was approachable with his teammates. He was fine, but I don't think he didn't want to be bothered too much, just because I think that there were so many goaltenders that didn't want to have anything to do with anybody the day of a game.
Tell me about Konstantinov, Bob, because we've talked about him often and just how underrated he was, but how physically tough he was, and a real pioneer at that position, much like Borja was, but certainly able to take it and dish it out.
Well, you're right about that, Paul. And, it's funny because we've talked about this on numerous occasions. To me, Vladimir Konstantinov was the toughest guy I ever played with and played against. I mean, he was one of those guys where he came over from Russia. I remember he was playing for Moscow Dynamo when they toured around, played against NHL teams. He was the captain of that hockey club, and hit him in the boards, in the turnbuckles at Chicago Stadium, and from 100 miles an hour to 0. And he just looked at me kind of like, "Is that all you got?" And he was one of those players you could absolutely. I see guys go after him and shish kebab him by spearing him, and he'd just look at the guy like, "Really? That's it? That's all you got?" And he'd give it right back to you. And I mean, it's just crazy what happened to him. After winning that Stanley Cup for the first time with the Red Wings in '97, the accident with the limousine driver and him being certainly not himself anymore. But by far, he was such a great player. And more than anything, though, he was so tough. And I think he was a huge addition to the Red Wings and a big reason why they got over that hurdle and ended up winning that first Stanley Cup back in '97.
Now, before we put a bow on this, I just needed to toss this picture up here, and hopefully in post, Kenny Mayhew, our producer, can add this in here. But we just needed the people of Leafs Nation to see this glorious shot of Bob McGill. Bob, look at that.
Yeah, look at the hair on that guy. Eh? What's funny is that that was, I believe, that was in Game 4 in Toronto. And Paul Coffey was supposed to come on with Ron McLean in between periods. And he was so pissed because now they were looking at having a tied series because the Leafs were up, but we were up by going into the third period. And so I kind of joked to Ron McLean, oh, I'll do it. And I had my jaw wired shut. And a couple of minutes later, they came in and they said, oh, can you come on? So that was me sitting with Ron McLean. And we did a little interview with my oath. My jaw was wired shut, so it was an interesting one, no doubt about it. But hey, it was kind of cool, I guess.
Incredible. Always a team player, Bob. Well, guys, this has been so much fun. We still have one more game, Game 7 in this series. So we're going to end it on this note. Make sure you tune into tonight's game. That is 6 o'clock on Sportsnet. And rejoin the gang on Friday where we put a bow on this series. We're going to have the killer, none other than number 93, Doug Gilmour, joining us. And this has been awesome. Thank you so much, guys. On behalf of Paul Hendrick, Bob McGill, and Joe Bowen, I'm Danielle Emanuele, and we will see you next time.